Welcome to Being Untamed, a channel focused on solutions-oriented activism through the lenses of cognitive science and systems theory. This is a new series I'm starting on why we don't act upon what we know to be truly important. I'm going to view this topic through several lenses and tie in concepts I alluded to in my previous videos. Specifically with this video, I will investigate why Communitas is the basis for moving forward and acting on things we know to be important. I'll follow up with a part 2 on this topic, moving away from the community example and something more broadly applicable regarding society and our psychology. Ultimately, this will lay the foundation for a second series on effective communicating, acting, and understanding, and how counterintuitive and interdependent they are. After contemplating this video series, I realized I'm converging on the Buddhist Eightfold Noble Path, and how what I'm laying out here is the details of moving from right view, right intention, and right speech into right action. Now, right view requires a powerful and meaningful vision and understanding to justify and motivate the entire changing of your being to embody the following stages. Describing my right view here would take way too long, so for the context of this video, I will return to my example of right view of creating decentralized, regenerative, socioeconomic system and culture. Previously on Being Untamed. In systems theory of village design, I touched on the necessity of decentralized networked organization and increasing our circle of empathy to build resilience. In holistic value systems for game B initiatives, I mentioned how we seem captivated by a metric that no longer serves its intended purpose. We need to radically question our value system as our monetary system is diverging from anything we can call adaptive, while acknowledging that the metric we agree on will become obsolete during these changing times. Alright, now let's get into the topic of today's video. The activist community has been approaching critical mass through education and awareness, and at least in my life, I've witnessed this readiness towards action. I mentioned how we can no longer have faith in our value system as it'll go through radical transitions in our lifetime, so regardless of the excuse offered, are we really convinced that it's worth investing our time and attention into this old socioeconomic system? Even me, who deeply sees the short-sightedness of these pursuits, still puts a large amount more of my time towards my career than towards things that are far more important or could have a much bigger positive impact. We must ask ourselves, why don't we devote our entire being towards saving this next extinction event and bringing some beauty, hope, and resilience to this next generation? Even the ones among us who intellectually know climate change and environmental disaster are in our future are simply frozen when it comes to acting. Most of us are too afraid to truly accept that all the converging crises is the reality we live in. If we act upon it, it becomes real, and it's too sad and too much for our hearts to bear. We can't take that leap of faith due to fear and disbelief. And it's truly a distraction to continue living that normal life, consume more ethically and thinking it'll solve it. That's the equivalent of putting blind faith in our authority of governments, technology, and religion. We need radical responsibility, not waiting for someone else to clean it up, not waiting to have the right title or the right role to act, not waiting for it to be fair or to be compensated to do the right action, but to go forth and take on more than your fair share of responsibility. There are many reasons why we can't feel like agents in this world, capable of doing anything towards a brighter future. Of course, there's short-sightedness, selfishness, learned helplessness, and the survival needs or fear of poverty. And in this video, I'm not talking to those who are truly unable, unaware, or stuck with the threat of violence. I'm talking to those who understand at their core that there is a problem, but have resistance to taking leap of faith, or who haven't found an avenue to move forward in this aim. But I want to take a different approach here. Later in the series, I will return to creating direction in the face of learned helplessness, meaning crises, and apathy towards any purpose of action. See, because I think a significant reason we continue to devote our time towards these aimless goals, or towards our jobs that aren't aligned with the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible, is because that's the only place we have community. That's the only place we feel like we can collaborate on something bigger than ourselves. Now, why is that? What are the group identities we have access to, and where is that community we long for? Because stepping into the unknown without a social network of committed people who can support each other is often too frightening. As we approach the critical mass of people who are committed to action, what are the catalysts that will ease the process for others and begin this transition? As humans, we have a unique ability to truly identify ourselves with things outside of our physical bodies. Everyone already does this. It's in our implicit metaphysics, our ideas we hold so strongly that we don't even understand when they're questioned. Or if we do, we uphold them to whatever means necessary, else we risk a partial death of our identification. And therefore, people are willing to die for their causes, or die to save their loved ones. We can temporarily identify with actors in movies, or video game characters, or our virtual bodies in virtual reality. Some of the most profound, blissful, and enjoyable experiences come from shedding our narrative construct. Yet we get so defensive and aggravated when our narratives are challenged. How can we understand this dichotomy, and what are the desirable states of consciousness we may experience when further shedding our identification? What modes of being are available to us that we may not be aware of? The vast differences in what we identify with just shows us the fluidity of our identification and how much of it is self-construction. And therefore, it's within our control to change it. But how do we navigate this freedom to change one's self-identification? Well, I'm going to refer to a few philosophers for this. William Blake famously said, "You become what you behold." In other words, we identify ourselves with what we pay attention to. And from Stoicism, maybe controversial origins, often called the serenity prayer, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And finally, eudaimonia, which combines you, good, and daimon, spirit, to describe a life well lived, or human flourishing. For Aristotle, eudaimonia is the highest human good, the only human good that is desirable for its own sake, as an end in itself, rather than for the sake of something else as a means for some other end. In contrast to hedonia, or a hedonistic version of happiness, eudaimonia seeks the process instead of the product of one's actions. Likewise, Epictetus taught that the path to a happy life, a life of what the Stoics called eudaimonia, was found in the serenity prayer, and at least what is pointing to correctly identify and focus our efforts on what is within our control and learning to accept what is not. Therefore, through mindfulness and wisdom in discerning of what is relevant, we can change what human being means. We can fall into right relationship with our identifications, to the narratives we hold, and the communities we belong to. In these quotes, you can also hear the connotations of right view and right intention, to discern a depth and clarity on how to find alignment in our being. And I'd like to introduce the concept of communitas. It's the very spirit of community, the feeling of great social equality, solidarity, and togetherness. It's when a community truly is building something important together and has a deep convergence in their meaning-making. And for the sake of this video, I'm arguing that both narrative identification and community identification are at the core of Communitas. These pillars construct the scaffolding for which society is built on, and throughout the series, I will continue to refer to this metaphor of scaffolding in various contexts. I touch on these topics in both of my last two videos, the different forms and scales of community identification from the family, tribe, city, and nation-state, and pointing to increasing our circle of empathy through time and space, and the narratives of religion, culture, economics, politics, disciplines of science or philosophy, and their assumptions and stories of how things will unfold. This shapes our role we have identified for ourselves in the group and the narratives we have identified for humanity's future and past. These belief systems guide our actions and provide a model to predict the future and agree on value, and therefore, what we pay attention to. All too often, these narratives we identify with paint a bright or dark future, both of which can lead to problematic outcomes. Now, there's another option here, to have an unexpected future. This brings us into participatory relationship with it. It's no longer a narrative outside of us, and therefore it's not about optimism or pessimism, but if it evokes apathy or action. Let's not get carried away with bright or dark narratives, and to be humble into not knowing how it will unfold and be able to sit in that unknowing. Certain cultures, like indigenous tribes, often seem to have an unexpected future, an unknown weather severity or an unknown harvest, and just like a pilgrimage, they don't know if they will make it. What wisdom can come from them when we face this unknown future? And to quote Charles Eisenstein, this kind of profound transition that we're going through, where the old narrative, the old story, and the old mythology is wearing thin and beginning to fall apart, and as it does so, people hold on to it even more tightly. They haven't let go and won't let go until it becomes simply impossible to hold on to it anymore. And we're nearing that time, but not yet. Right now, you can still pretend everything's normal, even though it's greatly hollowed out. It seems in order to support the centralization of power, such as nation states and corporations, it requires building a narrative around it. It's supported by the stories it tells itself, the history they are a part of, the visions of their future, the art, culture, and spirituality emerging from it. Ultimately, I think these large systems are trying to invoke a sense of communitas at scale as they build their community and narrative identifications. But if it lacks substance, it comes across as a delusion of grandeur when you see through the veil, and therefore they often rely on fear-mongering to sell their cult of safety and justify their existence. But I will refer to Academy of Ideas for more on that topic. Without these elements, the authority is simply not given to those who claim to have power, or at least it doesn't last long. It'll either crumble, or the people will fully adopt the views of another power and be subservient to them. For example, the US has a monopoly on the media landscape, thereby creating the dominant narrative. And, as I mentioned in the book Scale by Geoffrey West, cities behaved like living organisms, but nation-states and corporations didn't. Therefore, group identifications of these giant systems aren't tangible. The identification between yourself and another country member you will never meet has zero substance. All it does is act as a tool of separation in the mind of your people and the rest of the world. That's because it's not a relational thing. At least in the West, this imposed identification only seemed to be possible alongside the stripping of identification at the local level. We've lost the tribe, the family, and the communitas. The only thing that's left is the individual amongst these giant forms of identities. As humans, we have a deep longing to be part of something bigger than ourselves. This is for many deep spiritual reasons and a desire for collaboration. Additionally, it was an evolutionary effective feature as our minds get cognitive ease, giving up some sense-making to the crowd. It was very effective when we had a tribe who shared our best interest, but it becomes dangerous when we exact that same mechanism and forfeit our sovereignty to groups who don't share our interest. As governments are growing towards the desires of corporations and our everyday interactions as consumers is filled with people taking advantage of each other. Of course, there was always deception and misaligned interest throughout history, but this becomes significant when there's no tangible local community identification. Okay, but shouldn't we still strive for a larger group identification? As I also mentioned, we want to increase our circle of empathy. Because it can be argued that these larger forms of communitas have this much more profound and awe-inspiring vision of spiritual, intellectual, or technological potential, for which individuals can be a part of something bigger than themselves. There's certain value in increasing our tribe to several million in a nation, but the identification must be bottom-up. It's unstable to have strong national identification without the more local group identification. Without this local community identification, the larger identification can only be built upon manufactured narratives and an increasing pressure on the individual, as it's the next stable community identification. As we've seen globalism and individualism occur at extremes at the same time. I'd like to quote from Abraham Maslow. It is precisely the godlike in ourselves and others that we are ambivalent about, fascinated by and fearful of, motivated towards and defensive against. This is one aspect of the basic human predicament, that we are simultaneously gods and worms, gods with anuses. I think we would identify with everything between gods and worms if we had those networks of identifications established. But since our communal identification is fragmented, we feel like individuals amongst godlike power figures. This spiritual, intellectual, and technical potential is available at all levels and requires all levels to support it. Therefore, I don't think it's right in attributing the fruits of these domains to the larger identification. In fact, it's a much more profound and capable perspective when we identify as everything between gods and worms. I appreciate the image that Don't Look Up paints, at how quickly we are to have blind faith in anyone who claims to solve our problems, from technological, political, religious, or economic authority. This type of thinking simply delays the inevitable and breeds the learned helplessness which increases the significance of the problem until we are truly unable to act. As there is no solution at the 11th hour, only preventative action can even hope to solve anything. To solely identify with these grandiose potentials of the state or corporation, you must be truly motivated by and believe these narratives, thereby closing yourself to other possible future scenarios and guarding that narrative with a lot of mental gymnastics. Now, I'm not saying that potential futures of all large groups are false, but if you want to be attuned to this changing planet and seek truth at all costs to your social narrative, then we must not bias our identification too heavily in one future narrative. Expecting change through large-scale identifications is often futile or misguided, as it all too often falls into non-action and results in a virtue-signaling numbers game to get the patriarchal figure to solve our problems for us. There's no responsibility and no direct action. It's just an us versus them mentality, leading to learned helplessness. These organizations necessarily adapt slower to these changing times, and therefore their narratives collapse faster as they diverge from reality. There's truly a fine line between a healthy, large group identification and ideological thinking. How do we break from the shackles of learned helplessness and inaction that these large identifications seem to cause? There are people like Marcin Jakubowski, who I think understood this trend. He went from a PhD in nuclear physics to founding an open source ecology, which is a modular civilization starter kit, a community of people oriented around designing open source solutions that are DIY and modular, therefore are an adaptable and efficient use of resources because they are modular. In effect, he went from a career towards creating and requiring a large centralized group identity to one which supports decentralized resilient communities. Now, there's a shift occurring both in our narrative and group identities. We are rebuilding a new scaffolding for a parallel society, with new narratives and groups creating a participatory identification. I think it's inevitable that we will shift our focus to rebuilding a more local community identification through these changing times, and they will be the seeds of a new era of larger identifications to be built on. Through various means, we have put our faith in larger group identifications at the expense of our local relationships, which would have been able to form a tangible communitas. Some of these forces may have been malicious attempts to divide and conquer, to privatize public goods, to purposefully destabilize countries, to invoke a nuclear family, or to sell the identification of the nation-state or consumerism, but many of them are just a result of various forces like the mass migration to cities during the Industrial Revolution. We are dealing with the side effects of unconscious planning, unconscious value system, and exploitation. There is a notion in ecology and sociology whereby, through certain actions, you make ecological niches have harsh conditions, often through undermining the ecosystem. Now, something will still fill that niche, but it will be even more violent and ruthless to be able to survive in those conditions. We see this in bacterial colonies and terrorist groups. In other words, the environment we are in shapes what is possible for human organization. It biases what narrative and community identifications thrive. On one hand, the current modern system requires you to compete, market, and sell your services for the ideal of some intangible wealth and power, where you are stripped away from the impact of your labor and in a monetary and marketing game which has been hacked. The question really isn't about if competition or collaboration is more effective, but what environments support competition or collaboration. I will get more into this in the following videos. Just as we have had an industrial revolution which went from 20% of the population in urban settings and 80% in rural to 80% in urban and 20% in rural, we must be open to the possibility that we may see a mass exodus from urban areas during this revolution. Which is interesting, as having a tangible communitas and social interdependence as opposed to individualism partially solves the sense of learned helplessness and lack of direction mentioned earlier, as it provides a community of people who may need your services and who you are now in direct relationship with, giving a sense of purpose, agency, and communitas. In a decentralized network and organization, many things which support your life feel less like a job and more like a chore. Helping out others, growing food, cooking, tending to the solar panels, educating your children, and building out your own life support systems. These are directly actionable items and grow your resilience as individuals and community and have a direct or intrinsic reward for your action instead of extrinsic rewards. In later videos, I will return to the topic of extrinsic motivation and how it lends itself to this corruption and an unstable communitas and ultimately a poor motivator which is easily hacked and misguided. Intrinsic motivation, on the other hand, is related to eudaimonia. It's related to doing things for their own purpose. This is ultimately the kind of motivation which lends itself to the agency in communitas I just mentioned. This intrinsic motivation is an untapped creative potential which thrives in this new system. Mainstream society is only valuing labor which can be quantified. Meanwhile, the vast amount of other labor that is more qualitative and immeasurable, which is often the most important, doesn't get incentivized. And since creating value in this new system, as I mentioned in other videos, will be immeasurable, especially immeasurable and unknown to society's main market system, creating a local community in which that unique value can be seen and where proper feedback is reciprocated is pivotal. Being in contact with people that need something is the greatest motivator and meaning maker to give direction and purpose in life. I feel that we've been tamed, stripped of meaning, agency, and purpose by giving up our control. Our narratives have been too focused on things which aren't actionable. Our community identification has been undermined. By shutting our eyes to the root causes of the problems of the world, stripping our intrinsic value without the ability to see the fruits of one's labor, and providing an education to children for 20 years without a reason to why they're learning anything, we've become cogs in the machine. As we're moving into a world where automation and decentralization make it such that we become less robotic in our labor, and we therefore become more human, we need to develop how understanding and education, or incentives and motivation, operate in less rudimentary and quantifiable ways. Now, this is one narrative about our future. I'm inviting you to come along and see its potential, but the future won't just be one of these narratives. It'll likely contain all of them to a certain extent. What matters is which ones we give energy to through our actions. I'm pointing to a future in which we can organize in similar ways to the natural world, one which is in deep relationship with one another, to not reduce value to only what is quantifiable. This reductionism in value is leading to the collective delusions of creating large, centralized identifications at the cost of tangible ones. This was just the first half of the exploration of why we don't act on what we know to be truly important. I've hinted at right view and right intention by understanding our identifications and an orientation towards the structure of our relationships with others. The next video, I will move away from the community example to something more broadly applicable of society and our psychology. And then we can continue our journey onto the Noble Eightfold Path and ultimately recognizing the interdependence of each step.